Great, thank you. So I guess I'll get us started. Mila and I are going to be talking a little bit about the CSS profile today. And she gave us a little bit of an intro here. But obviously this is being recorded as a Zoom meeting. So if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to either stick up your hand or honestly just toss them out. You can put them in the chat if you're more comfortable with that. But whatever works for you. So thank you everybody for being with us today. And let's just get right into it. Talk about profile. So just the getting started piece and some of the housekeeping bits about what you're going to want to know when getting students ready to start filling out the profile. Are obviously the documents to have on hand, which is going to look a little bit different than that of the FAFSA. You're going to want a little bit more of that documentation, especially now that we've seen that shift go from things that are a little bit more automated, a little bit more manual to a little bit more automated with the FAFSA. So with the profile, it'll ask obviously for more deep dive in that income and assets piece. So you're going to want to have documents on hand like the two most recent years of W-2s and tax information, because it will ask questions that are a little bit further back, and it'll also ask for projections as well. You'll also want documentation of any untaxed income. So this is particularly more common on the student side. So even if the student didn't have to file taxes, you will need information on any of that untaxed income. So having some sort of documentation for that will be important. You also want things like bank statements, and a little bit more hallmarkingly is the mortgage information. It will ask for a value of things like your primary residence. So how much you have in equity in that will be important to know. So therefore you'll need the mortgage information as well. The profile does ask about other pieces like retirement information. So having that on hand is important. Obviously, these are pieces that you can save and go back to. So if you don't have the ability to have that on hand initially when you're starting to fill it out, that's okay, but you will need these pieces of documentation to complete the form. They also recommend that you have social security numbers that you're aware of. So those aren't necessarily required on the form for parents, but it makes it a little bit easier for the colleges to be able to access the information and refer back to your form if you do have questions, if you have access to those social security numbers. And then moving on to the sign-in information, that also, again, is a little bit different from the FAFSA, but it is similar in some ways. So the way that you will log in to the CSS profile is directly through the College Board website. So, a fair number of students might actually already have accounts set up at College Board. So whether they've taken exams like the SAT, the PSAT, or any of the AP exams, that would be the same username and password that they set up for that piece. If they have not taken any of these exams, the student can go ahead and create a new account. There isn't that waiting period like there is with the FAFSA where you'll need to be verified with that information. So going ahead and just creating a new account before they go through the process of filling out the form is absolutely all right. The other piece that's important to note is that custodial parents will use the same account as the student. So that's something to remember, that the custodial parents don't need to go in and create their own account. They will go ahead and answer those questions right on the student application. The only parents that will need to have their own College Board account are in the instances of non-custodial parents needing to answer questions on the form. We'll talk a little bit about that moving forward, but that is only in instances of specific schools. I believe that all the schools in Maine do require questions from non-custodial parents, so don't be surprised if that's something that is needed, but definitely something that's worth checking out even before going and completing the form, just to be aware of whose information is going to be needed there. We will share a resource on that as well. Other pieces that are important are obviously make sure the student is using their full legal name when signing up for the account, as well as using resources that they will be able to access in the future. So things like a personal email or a school or, things like a school email or a work email wouldn't be best options for that. We would suggest that they will use a personal email that they will have access to in the foreseeable future. Other pieces to note when getting this form, getting ready to file the form, is that obviously it's not going to be needed at all schools. The CSS profile only applies to about 240 different colleges, and these are those private institutions. So being able to go back and look at those pieces and figure out exactly what schools you'll need to be aware of deadlines for is really important before you get the form started. The CSS profile has this really, really great resource, the College Board does on their website, that is basically a dynamic chart that you can go through and see a number of different pieces of information on what is going to be required for specific schools, including if the form's required at all, the deadline for that, and whose information is going to be needed. Going along with that, it's important to obviously review the submission deadlines for individual schools. So similar to the FAFSA, different schools have different deadlines. So not, beyond the whole admissions piece, be aware of the financial aid deadlines as well, is really important. Another piece that is pretty different is the required questions. So the CSS doesn't operate under the assumption that all questions are required. They indicate which questions are required on the form. This can be indicated in a number of different ways, but typically you'll see in parentheses and it'll say required. We have a screenshot of it right there on the slide. But even questions, as I alluded to, such as the parent social security numbers, are optional on the form. Another piece is the cost to submit, where obviously the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, is free to students. That is not the case with the CSS profile in a number of situations. The total cost is determined by the number of schools that the student is applying to. There is an initial fee for filing of $25, with each additional school costing a standard rate of $16 as well. However, there is a pretty broad range of eligibility for fee waivers that's available with the CSS profile. The student would be able to see by logging in to their account in most situations if they are eligible for a fee waiver. If they qualify, it'll show right up there. But otherwise, this is basically the basic requirement of if they would be eligible for a fee waiver form. So you can inform them of that. One important piece is that the student must be domestic. So if they're an international student, they do not automatically qualify for a fee waiver. That is something that they would need to go through a manual process of requesting. But if it is a domestic student that you're working with, if they've qualified for an SAT or an ACT fee waiver, they will automatically qualify and it will be applied to their College Board account. Similarly, if their family's AGI or adjusted gross income is $100,000 or less, and then the piece of if they are orphan or ward of the court under the age of 24. Those are the three major pieces that would have them automatically qualify, and it would automatically be applied to their College Board account, which again, they could log in and view right on their account there. But if they don't qualify automatically, it's not an end all be all. They might still be able to have access to a fee waiver. So the best way to do that is actually reach out and contact the college specifically to see if they could be eligible and if the college could provide them a code that is then applied at the end of basically the filing process. When payment is asked for, they can punch in the code there. But yeah, that's an option. So if you are working with an international student, that's another instance of which they would want to contact the school for further assistance to see if they would be eligible for a waiver. So moving on from cost and looking a little bit about starting the sections of the form itself. That's kind of how we're going to move through the presentation. Today, we'll be talking about the different sections of the form, talking about the student information, the parent information, things like income and assets. But starting with student demographics, the questions it asked are, kind of a little bit boilerplate, honestly. This isn't the big shock of the CSS profile. The student's going to need to provide some basic information. So things like their permanent residency, if they're a citizen, what high school did they attend, some of that basic information. And they will answer some of those similar background questions, again, to the FAFSA. So they'd probably be pretty comfortable being able to answer these. So whether or not they've been part of the foster care system or if they've served in the military. We've also included some screenshots throughout this presentation, but Mila will show you some of our resources at the end of this that we have provided access to. So if you do have questions about specific wording on the profile, we have a really great resource where you can go and take a peek at those screenshots later on. One other tip that we like to remind people of is the student will be asked about what college grade level they will be entering in for when they're filing the form. And we always suggest that they fill out first year undergrad. This is even for students who have some amount of, minor college credit, whether or not they've participated in dual enrollment, they have some sort of AP credits. Regardless, they would want to select first year undergrad. And again, that piece does live in the student demographics section. So just something to remind them of and keep your wits about you for that piece. Only really tricky part there. And then after the student's demographics are inputted, parental demographics will be asked. The first piece that you'll want to make sure that they're doing is that they begin this section for the student that, the parent that will be completing the application. So the primary parent, the parent that you're almost certain will need to input information on the application is the parent that you'd want to input here. You wouldn't necessarily want to do someone who might qualify as a non-custodial parent or even a step parent. You'd want to have that first parent enter this information. From there, it'll be indicated whether or not other parents will need to provide information on the form. But the basic information that the parent will be asked, similar things, date of birth, email address, phone number, and they'll even be asked their social security number. So like I alluded to, that is totally optional whether or not they fill it out. One thing that they will want to know is if they do not have access to this parent's social security number, the parent doesn't want to input their social security number for whatever reason it is, don't input zeros in this. Just leave it blank if you're not going to provide the social security number in this piece. If the parent is married, they'll submit the same information about the other parent as well. Just again, those basic demographic pieces. If the parents aren't married, this is the piece that they'll start trying to figure out whether or not the non-custodial parent will need to be providing information. So the CSS, again, has this really, really great dynamic table that does provide information about whether or not, school specifically, whether or not non-custodial parent information will be required on the form. If they do, in this instance, this portion of the profile will request their basic information as well as their email address, because it will send the non-custodial parent an email just saying, hey, you're going to need to go under the process of basically completing your own portion of a form. We'll talk about this and exactly what that looks like a little bit later on, but just know that that will be something that will be asked. So if non-custodial parent information is required, the student should go through the process of, checking with that parent if possible, as to what their email address would be, and, know their basic information that will need to be filled out. So in certain situations in which a student may not have access to or contact with that non-custodial parent, a student can receive or request a waiver for this as well. Again, this will be school specific, so have the student contact the school independently. This isn't something that they could waive through the College Board site, but it could be requested due to a number of different circumstances, including documented abuse situations, any sort of legal order from the court. If they even haven't had any contact or support from that non-custodial parent, and this is something that they can demonstrate to the college. However, we do like to remind people that parent refusal to fill this out in its own does not qualify as basically a justification to receive a waiver for this portion. Next, the student will be asked basic academic information. So details about their current high school and their college plans. They'll want an exhaustive list of the colleges in which they're planning to apply for. If they do not have this, or they're not certain of all of the colleges that they're going to apply for, more can be added later. They can save and move forward from this section. But it's a really great idea to have those things on hand earlier on. They will also be asked questions about what their plans are for housing. This is important to have an idea of because obviously that can impact the aid they'll be eligible for. All right. Mila, did we want to pause and see that question?
Yes. So the question is, I have a student with a parent in another country, no internet, can't read English. Is this something I should pursue a waiver for non-custodial parent info? So I'm gonna make the initial assumption that the parents are not married, because if the parents are not married, that's a different answer than if the parents are married. Okay, but assuming the parents aren't married, so that would be a non-custodial parent, that I would absolutely talk to the schools. Each of the schools that the student is applying to that do require the CSS profile, have a conversation with them. I mean, I can't answer for them. I certainly think that that is, a potentially really good reason to waive the requirement for the non-custodial parent, but it is going to be a school by school decision. Of course, if the parents are married, so we might have a parent living here in the US and a parent in another country, then the parent that lives here in the US can just fill out the form and provide information for both parents. But I'm thinking that this is a non-custodial parent that's living outside the country. So yes, please talk to the schools.
Great, thank you. Okay, when looking at the parental details and income section, this is kind of the big chunk that's taken up on the form, asking about parental details, and obviously the asset portions are longer on the CSS than they would be on the FAFSA. So they'll be asked questions about the parents' employment, retirement plans, and any other forms of income. It's a pretty invasive section, so having the student and the parent sit down together and fill this out is pretty important. They'll also need access to the parents' tax return information, as well as the W-2s. So have those on hand as just a reminder. If the student does not have access to this for their parent, have them leave it blank. Don't have them, populate the fields with zeros or anything like that. But they will, again, need to contact the college and follow up and let them know and explain as to why this section has been left blank. Again, longest section of the CSS profile is the parent income piece. It'll ask questions about past income as well as future income. So again, having documentation for the last 2 years is important. But it'll also ask for projections into the future. So having an idea about what they could expect in the coming year is important. If it's projected that the income should stay the same, really just follow along with past tax returns. And when I feel like we get a lot of questions surrounding the parental asset piece. That's really the piece that's very different from the FAFSA form. So when we're talking about the parental assets, it's really a much more deeper and invasive dive. So having documentation on hand is really important, and remembering that some of these pieces are estimates. So things like properties, investments, retirement accounts, and value owned, just like any sort of value that's owned by a parent, will really be asked for on the form. Again, home equity of a primary residence is asked about. So having information on current mortgage information is something that they will want to have on hand to be able to answer that. And then 529s are asked about in the case of both the student as well as their siblings. So that's the big difference there. So sibling 529s are asked about on the CSS profile. So other real estate properties, so whether they have a camp or another home, that's something that will need to be answered on the form. And then family businesses. So again, something that is also now asked for on the FAFSA as well. But just generally a deeper dive, really. The form will also ask about parent expenses. So, this is kind of the give and take of the CSS profile where, yes, they are asking for more detailed answers about assets. They do ask for more information about expenses and special circumstances. So there is a little bit more leeway on the form to provide information about that, which in itself is pretty great. So it will ask about child support paid by either parent, as well as things like alimony, but also asks questions about out-of-pocket medical or dental expense. So that's a really great piece that they actually factor right into the form and allow you to answer questions about, where if this was something that you wanted to provide information about in relationship to the FAFSA, you would have to reach out to the college. The form actually asks for that information up front, and you're able to provide information on that. So have an idea of that in the back of your head before you go to fill out the form. And then also things like educational expenses and loans. So this could range anywhere from a parent paying on student loans for another sibling to costs of, privatized education or private school. So we have a screenshot there as well. So you can see where they ask about the medical and dental expense question. The form does a really great job of providing this hint yellow box section that gives you a little bit of context around each question, which is great. So you can see here that it needs to total more than 3% of their total income if they're going to include it on the form. So you can click yes there, you can click no there, and then it'll move forward to asking you additional questions about that. And then the special circumstances section as well. This is particularly, again, geared towards the expenses portion. So that can range anything from maybe you needed to replace the roof on your house and you want to include information about that. Maybe the parent provides financial support to another family member, but that family member doesn't live with them. So that wouldn't be something that is asked for black and white on the form, but something you would want to provide information on in the special circumstances section. So outlining this at the end of the form, we're saying, yes, a special circumstance does apply to me, and then being able to explain it in a text box. That's a really, really nice portion of the form that it does include as well. It tries to get a holistic look at assets as well as expense. So as alluding to that in the last question, talking a little bit about household information and who is included in that. So providing basic demographic information about who lives in the home is asked for on the form. So this can include obviously things like siblings, but can be anything from step siblings to grandparents, or even people who are not necessarily related, but are living in the home and are being provided financial support. So again, doesn't just fall to tax dependents, but anybody who's financially supported by those who are considered parents on the form. Alrighty, so looking a little bit about the student's income and assets. So we talked about the parent portion, obviously a lot of information there, but the student's portion looks a little bit different as well. So reporting not just the tax return information for the student, but if they had a job at all and they accumulated income, this is something that they're going to need to answer questions about on the form. So it'll be asked to report whatever was filed on a tax return. Again, if there isn't a tax return, then you'll have to report the income in a different section of the form. If you're uncertain of the exact number, so say maybe you don't have perfect documentation of what that is, an estimate is, what you're going to have to go with. So another piece that's asked, similar to the parent portion, is an estimate of future earnings, so a projection of that. This is different than the parent portion. For the student, it's an estimate of any sort of future income in the short term, so not post-graduation. They're looking for what is going to basically end out that year, and that's what they want you to attest to regarding future earned income. And then the student section also has another portion that's a little bit different, which is the student resource section. And this is kind of the catch-all that they put there for the student. So any sort of additional money that you might not have mentioned that they might have access to. So this could be financial help from family. So maybe there's like a grandparent who is planning on putting money towards tuition. They would want you to report that in this portion of the form, as well as any other grants, scholarships, or even financial help from employers if they're getting like employer assistance for funding school. Those would all want to be reported in this portion of the form. And then the student's assets, which are a little bit more straightforward. So things like cash, checking, savings accounts, any retirement accounts that the student has access to, and investment funds. So pretty boilerplate with the assets for the student. Alrighty, and I think this is where we switch over to Mila.
Yeah. So, I think the section you were just talking about, Michelle, really highlights one of the differences between the FAFSA and the CSS profile in that, there's not the same sort of skip logic built into the profile. I'm not going to say there's not any, but it's not to the extent that's in the FAFSA. So, students might be surprised if they didn't file taxes. Now on the FAFSA that was updated last year, students who don't file taxes don't have to provide any income information, and they won't even see questions once they indicate that they haven't filed taxes. Where on the profile, they are going to get to that information. And the same thing with the assets, right? On the FAFSA, some people don't have to provide any asset information, but they always will be asked that on the CSS profile. So, I think sometimes people think the same sort of information is asked for, but that's the reason why schools use a profile, is because they want to get at some of that information that's not available on the FAFSA. So, all right. Well, Michelle, do you mind going to the next slide?
Absolutely.
So Michelle mentioned that there is the ability to provide special circumstances, which is one of the real significant benefits to the CSS profile. It is much more comprehensive, so it's going to ask more questions, but it also provides an easier ability to provide additional information that the FAFSA does not provide the opportunity to do. So as you move through the CSS profile and you get through all of the sections that Michelle has mentioned, you're then going to see a question that asks about special circumstances. And they actually have a list of special circumstances that people can check off. So for example, a change in employment, exceptional medical or dental expenses, like Michelle discussed, elder care or financial support for other family members, non-recurring income or expenses, and then they have the other category. So it's a great opportunity for people to be able to provide a little bit of insight as to what's really going on within their family or what might have changed recently since the last tax returns were filed. So within that special circumstances category, we do tend to think about changes that are really related to, the family's income and family size. And then we think about the expenses that might not be listed. So we're going to kind of break those into two groups. So if a family is in a situation where there has been a job loss or a decrease in salary, it's going to be really important to check that box off and then add some additional information in the comments section, but likely having to follow up with each specific school, because these schools are not going to share this sort of information, follow up with each school to let them know and provide documentation. They're going to want to see things like, a severance letter or a pay stub or, a way to estimate what the true income is currently. If the family size changes, that's going to be important as well, especially if for some reason maybe a person who was a member of the family and was a wage earner is no longer in the family. That's really important to let the school know that, because obviously that's going to have a significant impact. Both the FAFSA and the CSS profile kind of are a snapshot in time, but things are going to change after that, or might have already changed even at the time that the form is being filed. Also, that additional family member piece. If family members are not physically living in the household, you want to convey that. I mean, I think there are a lot of families out there where there might be an elderly parent, and the elderly parent is not living with them. But the reality is that the family might be supporting that elderly parent, maybe paying some of their bills, or just making sure that financially the family member is okay. That money that's going to the elderly parent, for example, is not there to help pay for higher ed. So schools can take that into consideration. How they handle it might be different by school, but it's really important to let the school know that, because if they don't know it, they can't do anything about it. And then sometimes we have a situation where there are two households. So you might have a married couple, right? So they're both going to be listed on the CSS profile. Their information is going to be included. There's always the assumption that, of course, it costs money to run a household. But in some cases, let's just say the one of the parents is living a distance away. So maybe they have an apartment, in a town or a city, a little bit further away because that's where their job was, and maybe that's where they live during the week. So they have, the rent, they have food, they have travel expenses that may not be covered by work. In that case, again, they want to let the school know that so that the school can take that into consideration because schools do want to understand what's actually happening with the family. And schools that use the CSS profile, this has been my experience, do tend to have, probably per student, a larger staff, and they spend a lot of time, really trying to work with the families to make sure that it is affordable to attend that institution and that they're aware of the circumstances the families are facing. So then on the next slide, we want to talk about those expenses that don't show up on the form at all. So, we sometimes will have situations, these are just some examples of a sibling that won't be able to live independently. Maybe they are older, but they aren't able to work and financially support themselves. So what does that mean to the family budget? Travel for specialized medical treatments. I talk about this when we're talking about the FAFSA as well. The formulas do take into account that people have medical expenses, but sometimes those medical expenses are really, really significant. And the other thing is that sometimes the medical expense itself is not the most challenging piece financially. Maybe it's that people are having to travel. So imagine a scenario where someone's having to travel to Boston on a regular basis to get treatment. There's gas, there's tolls, there's hotel rooms, there's food, there's all of those associated expenses. Schools want to know about that because it might look on paper like the family has this amount of income, but if a chunk of that income is going to whatever expense, then they can take that into consideration. So the key is to provide as much detail as possible. Schools are going to need that documentation because what schools actually do is they go in and they adjust that AGI to reflect something that's more realistic. So in order to make an adjustment to like a data field, they need documentation as to what they should be adjusting and by how much. So that's really important. Other non-discretionary expenses are important as well. A couple that are mentioned here specifically, if there's a fire, a flood, or, replacement of a roof or furnaces, for goodness sakes. It seems like every year I talk to some families who's there, they had to replace their furnace unexpectedly. Those are huge expenses. So being sure to provide details on that. So if they can check off that box, if there's a situation in their case where they could just check off a box of their special circumstances, that's great. If it doesn't fit into those categories that they've already predetermined, check other. But regardless of which box they check, be sure they provide as much detail here in this special circumstances box as they can, up to 2,000 characters. So what you want to do is provide all of the schools with a little bit of a snippet of what's going on, and then you will follow up individually with each of those schools to actually provide that documentation. But this gives them the heads up that something's going on. I'm not sure schools will reach out specifically based on this. I would still assume that you would need to be reaching out to the school, but it does give them some, a little bit of a taste of what you have going on. Okay. The other thing I wanted to, before we talk about submitting, I did want to mention that some schools also do ask supplemental questions. So at the very end, sometimes you think you're done, and then you get to these questions that it will tell you very clearly which school is wanting some additional information. So my oldest son, years ago, we did the profile, and one of the schools he was looking at wanted to know about our cars. They wanted to know, what year our cars were, what make and model, and things like that. And what they're trying to get at is, okay, what are the family's resources in total looking like? But some other questions that I think many schools here in Maine, I mean, the only schools that use the profile here in Maine are Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby, but I think all three of them will ask things like 529 plans. On the form, you're going to list 529 plans that are owned by the parent or the student. Students can own one if they're 18 as well. but they want to know, some of these schools in their supplemental questions, is there somebody else that has a 529 plan for that student? So does their grandparent have one? Does an aunt or an uncle? Because they really want to know that. That's not going to show up like on the FAFSA anywhere, but on the CSS profile, that is an important factor for some schools. The other thing, so they're gathering information about all of your sources of income, but as we've been talking about, they also want to get a comprehensive sense of your expenses. So for example, one of the things that some schools will ask in their supplemental questions are about taxes. They want to know what your state, local real estate and property taxes are. Certainly even here in Maine and other parts of the country, to a larger extent, maybe even, property taxes are unbelievably high. That doesn't get captured anywhere, but that there is the ability for people to, see those questions from some schools and provide that sort of information. So those, you may have no supplemental questions, or your students may have no supplemental questions, or they may have several supplemental questions. It really is school specific. All right. So once all the questions are answered, demographic information for the student, demographic information for the parent, income information, asset information, special circumstances, that's all done. And it all goes in sequence, all within this one form, unless there's a non-custodial parent. At the end, they will be ready to submit the form. And so that is when they will see whether or not a fee is required. So again, as Michelle mentioned, if they have already received a fee waiver because of SATs or ACTs, that will already be applied. If in going through the form, the family is earning less than $100,000, that behind the scenes will be calculated. And so it'll be obvious that they're eligible for a fee waiver, so they won't have to pay for this. If they are an orphan under the age of 24 and some of those other circumstances, that will be calculated automatically. And so there won't be a fee that will show at all. If they have a fee waiver code, then they would enter that. So let's just say that the college has given them a fee waiver code. They didn't meet the other criteria, but they have a fee waiver code. Then they could enter that at that point in time. If they think they may be, this may be a case where they can get a fee waiver, but they haven't reached out to the school yet, or they haven't heard from the school yet, they want to hold tight, because if they go ahead and they pay, they can't get reimbursed. So they need to talk to the school first if they're requesting a fee waiver. Again, assuming they're not already eligible for a waiver, they want to hold tight, get the fee waiver so that they can enter the fee waiver code before they submit the CSS profile. If they go ahead and pay, they can't get reimbursed. So for those who don't qualify for a fee waiver, they're just going to use, their credit card or their debit card and follow the instructions to pay that fee, just like we do in all sorts of different situations. It is all secure, and your information is kept confidential. We do recommend that people, before they submit the form, or after they submit the form, take a copy of it. So it's a great idea to save it as a PDF, or if you want to print off a hard copy of it, it's helpful to have that. The CSS profile isn't quite like the FAFSA, in many, many ways, one of which is when the FAFSA is submitted and processed, you can go in and look at the FAFSA submission summary. It doesn't work quite the same way with the profile. So right at the time of submission, if you can grab that PDF of it or print it off so that you have it if questions come up going forward, or if it's required again next year, it's really kind of helpful to see, okay, how did I answer these questions last year? So that's a tip that we would like people to take advantage of if they can. Now, making corrections. Okay, this is kind of crazy with the CSS profile, and I think this is a process. I understand why it's not quite as streamlined as the FAFSA. The schools all want to deal with things a little bit differently. These schools that use the profile, again, are going to dig much more into family situations. And so they don't want to allow the family to make all of these adjustments to the CSS profile afterwards. So here's what happens is that sometimes if there's a mistake, it can be fixed. So the CSS profile only allows one correction per year. So first of all, only one per year. And for any additional revisions, the applicant must reach out to the school directly. Some items can be fixed online, like dependency status, or there's some fields that if they were left blank, the individual can go back in and add that information and submit a correction basically. but there's not the ability to make any changes to financial income. In all cases, when it comes to financial income, they're going to need to reach out to the school directly. So there are cases where, they can't make a line by line correction, but they can put in content into a standard text box. So, I'm going to be honest with you. I know this sounds a bit confusing. Michelle and I spent some time this fall in particular trying to get a good handle on the corrections process for the CSS profile. And it's just not, it's a little bit muddy. So what I would say, if corrections need to be made, the first thing to do is to go to the profile and see if it is a correction that can be made to the form. If it can be made as a line by line correction, great, make the correction. If it can't be made as a line by line correction, go ahead in and enter the information in a standard box that is provided so that you can let the schools know that there's an issue with the form and that something needs to be corrected. Regardless of any of that, you do want to follow up with the school. So even if you are providing, some details in that text box, be sure that you follow up with the school. Corrections typically become available late November. Keep in mind that the profile has been available on October 1st, all throughout the last decade or so, maybe even longer. So while the FAFSA has been delayed a bit the last couple of years, back on track next year. But while the FAFSA has been delayed, the CSS profile has continued to be available October 1st. So corrections are delayed a little bit. So it's not like they can make those corrections right away. Okay. So next, let's talk a little bit about IDoc. So IDoc is the Institutional Documentation Service. So IDoc is basically an online platform that's connected with the CSS profile, and many schools use IDoc because what IDoc allows families to do is to see what financial information is requested and to upload that into the IDoc platform. The IDoc platform will then take responsibility for taking that information and sharing it with the schools that use IDoc. So let's just say it's a scenario where a student is applying to multiple CSS profile schools. And let's say all of those schools use IDoc. The convenience is that they just have to upload the information into IDoc, and IDoc will share it with the multiple schools. Otherwise, they would have to provide it to each of the individual schools. So IDoc is meant to make the process a little bit easier for families and for schools. So what documents get uploaded into IDoc? It does vary by school, but pretty typical examples are going to be tax returns, W-2 forms, business tax returns, and things of that nature. So again, what they want for the CSS profile, those schools that use it, they actually want to look at tax returns. They're going to take a look and see, what's on the individual lines of those tax returns. And that's both good and bad because they can both see the income, but they can see if you've got a business, what your expenses were based on your tax returns. So it's that sort of information that typically is requested and uploaded in IDoc. The special circumstance stuff, still not as much. Work with the individual schools on that. Now, not every school uses IDoc. So my son went to a school that didn't use IDoc at all. So he still filled out the profile. They still wanted tax returns. They still requested tax returns, but we sent them to the school directly. So that is going to vary. Now, Michelle, I'm going to try. Let's see. Can you allow me to share? Okay. Because what I wanted to show everybody is I wanted to show you, let's see if I can get there quickly. I wanted to show you this form here that Michelle mentioned earlier. Let's see if I can do this. Okay. Real time, testing it out. Okay, so here's a form that Michelle was mentioning earlier that I think is super duper handy. So this is right on the homepage of the CSS profile. But one of the things that it does is it lets you know whether the CSS profile is required for which schools. But then, as Michelle mentioned in her section, this is where you can see whether a school wants non-custodial parent information. So like at American University, yes, they do. They want to have that custodial parent's information, and then that non-custodial parent is going to need to fill out their section of the of the CSS profile. But Arizona State University, for example, doesn't want that. So this can be really helpful in terms of planning. But then you can also see which schools require IDOC. And you can sort this, so you can look at just the schools that do or just the schools that don't. So this is where you can get a good indication of which schools do. Here it looks like more schools don't than do. I kind of took a quick look at all of the schools in the list, and I would say it's more like half and half. Okay, so a good number of schools do use it, and then a number of schools do not. So that's a good resource to help you kind of plan accordingly. All right, so now back to our presentation. When the documents will be requested, you might wonder, they're going to be requested immediately. So once the CSS profile is submitted, the student and family will immediately see if the school is an IDOC school, or if they have a school that is an IDOC school, they're going to see the request for that additional information. So it's incredibly important, as with any part of this process, to stay on top of the email. An email will be sent from IDOC with a link to submit documentation later. If the student is not able to submit it immediately, or the parents aren't able to submit it immediately. So again, staying on top of emails, watching for information to come in from the schools, or being aware of who might be sending information is incredibly important. All right, if you don't mind going to the next slide, Michelle. So one of the things I just wanted to take a step back and summarize as we come close to finishing up this session. When we talk about the CSS profile, it is a form that, again, these 240 or so schools use, but I want to just remind people that they can only use it to award their own institutional aid. So every school out there is required to use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for federal financial aid. And here in Maine, the FAFSA is also used to determine eligibility for the Maine State Grant Program. But schools like Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby, many schools in the Boston area that require the CSS profile, they're going to use this information to award their institutional aid. And that's where the bulk of the information, or the bulk of the aid, comes from, is from the school itself. So there is no fixed formula. There is technically an institutional methodology or a basic formula that is used, but schools are able to tweak that and use whatever information they would like to. The tough thing is with the profile is the formulas are proprietary. So unlike in our next session, if you want to join us for the SAI session, we're going to go through the formula. We can tell you exactly what impacts the student aid index, but we can't tell you exactly what impacts and to what extent information that's included on the CSS profile is going to impact. So it's one of those things where it is going to vary by school, which is both good because schools have flexibility, but it also means that the answers might be different from individual schools, and it does mean working with each of those schools to make sure that you have provided up-to-date information. So that's how basically schools are going to do that. They're going to award their aid based on their parameters, but it's critically important to provide any additional information so they can take that into account, because they can take into account some things that maybe wouldn't get updated on the FAFSA. All right, next, Michelle. And then in closing, we wanted to share some resources that are relatively new resources. So if you go to famemaine.com/educators, this is the page that's all for you. This is where we put a lot of FAFSA resources, but we have this year added some CSS profile resources. So the two big ones, one is the Comparing the FAFSA and CSS Profile. Michelle and I discussed this in the fall, and we said, we know we want to provide more resources about the CSS profile, and we thought a good place to start was with kind of the 10 things that make the CSS profile and the FAFSA different. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about that in a moment. And then the other thing that Michelle did that was just, I think, so incredibly helpful is she literally went through the CSS profile using various scenarios and took screenshots of all of the various screens. I can't remember off the top of my head, Michelle, how many screenshots there are. It's over 100. I think it might be, yeah.
I was going to say it's over 100 pages.
100 pages, right? So as she mentioned earlier, if you want to take a look at this document, you will be able to see the exact wording of questions, the flow of the questions, and things like that. So, we tried to do a high-level overview today, but if you want to really dig into all of those individual questions, those screenshots will allow you to do that. So you can click on that document. And then next, Michelle, if you want to go to the next slide. Here is that document that I was mentioning first, the 10 differences for undergraduate students between the FAFSA and the CSS profile. You can either print it off as a PDF or you can just look at it in real time on the website. But we do go through those 10 things that we think are the most different. So it's everything from, how you sign in and the structure. The FAFSA is roles based. The CSS profile, aside from the fact that a non-custodial parent might have to provide information. If you've got a married couple, then you're just going to do one form. And it just has one long section. So we talk about everything from that to the cost, to some differences in dependency status. So when students are in foster care, that key age is 13 on the FAFSA, but it's 18 on the profile. So we'd love to have you take a look at this, and hopefully it's a very useful resource to you. But I would ask that if you have other resources that you would like to see related to the CSS profile, let us know. We do hear your requests, and we will do our absolute best to accommodate them and provide additional information where needed. So that's what I have for today. And following up on Michelle's great content, does anyone have any questions? And again, please, there's just a small group of us, so you can take yourself off mute and ask your question. I do know we're at time. The next session is going to start at 10 o'clock, but we do have a moment if you have a burning question. Okay, seeing none. So the next session that we're going to have here in this Zoom room is going to be the SAI calculation. So if you want to attend that, you can stay right here, and we're going to switch over and pull up that presentation. I'm going to stop recording.